speculative fiction. Olu Amanashan, Deirdre Hollmann, and Fube. I hope I pronounced everybody's name correctly. Please, if I didn't. But you are all connected with Columbia University, and Olu, take it.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's so lovely to see so many faces here today. It's a wonderful way to spend my Saturday. So as Amanda said, today we are discussing the intersection of speculative work and speculative thinking with Maxine Greene's work, because I think there's really exciting work there to be done. And so we're going to have each presenter share a little bit about themselves. And I'll also ask that alongside your bio, you also answer the question, what is one speculative text that has inspired you or you would like recommend as well? So do our presenters need time, or would you like me to go first? How do you feel?
Why don't you start us off, Olu?
Okay, I'll start us off. So hi, my name is Olu Animashuan. I am currently a doc student at Teachers College at Columbia University. I'm also a 6th grade ELA teacher. Essentially, I teach 10 and 11-year-olds English literature and English language skills. The speculative text that has currently been inspiring me is Pet by Agwake Mezi. That work starts off with imagining a part of America as a utopia, and I think that's a really interesting space for young people to start thinking about the possibilities of imagining differently for America, and that's just an interesting thought project for both me as a teacher and also for my students as well. So that's the one that's been in the books for me currently. Well, Amanda, I'm going to kick it off to you.
All right, thank you. So I am a teacher educator at Lehman College, and as I've said before, I teach in the middle and high school education department, and I coordinate the English Ed program. And my mission in life is to integrate aesthetic education and interaction with the arts into everything I do there. And and to that end, I want to actually mention two works of speculative fiction that I've come to, and nothing says imagining things as if they could be otherwise better than speculative fiction. It's the very definition of what happens there, and what I see in current speculative fiction that I've gravitated towards is that the whole history of what we used to call science fiction is kind of dominated by white male voices, and just the idea of speculative fiction including a world in which the voices of diverse people are centered, and that it's not all necessarily about like, okay, we've destroyed the world, now we have to fight for survival of, and whatever smoldering scraps remain of the world. So starting with Octavia Butler, who really was centering the idea of in her book Kindred, going back in time of what would happen to a contemporary young Black woman who was just forcibly time traveling to times of slavery, and how she would use her resources as a contemporary person to survive that, and how she would be shaped by it. Then moving forward to a contemporary book by N.K. Jemisin called The City We Became, which is imagining the idea of cities as living entities and human avatars representing those cities, and the idea of a force of racism and gentrification and white supremacy trying to destroy those cities and take them down, while young, diverse people arise as avatars to save the city, and only by working together can they do that. And it was a great work for me to explore, because it just was a wonderful also meditation on the idea of what is a city and why do we live in cities, and why how does that form of human organization inform us? Why are cities important? And then one more work called the Monk and Robot series, A Psalm for the Wild Built, which imagines a future in which we have stopped short of destroying the planet and are rethinking the idea of a relationship between humans and technology and artificial intelligence, where we actually allow ourselves to be ourselves and support each other. So I'll stop now and hand it off to Deirdre.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I'm Deirdre Hollmann. I'm a doctoral student at Teachers College, Columbia University. My background is I studied art history as an undergraduate and have worked extensively in the museum world as an educator, but also bringing both my art and education skills into working in history museum spaces, where I was the director of education exhibitions at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem for the bulk of my career, over 15 years before pursuing my doctorate. And so there's, for me, an extremely rich connection between the study of art and experience that we find in the archives as well. And there's a lovely conversation between the found objects of the past in that way and the way we experience the world presently. And so to that end, I think a piece of speculative fiction that I would recommend is the short film Pumzi, P-U-M-Z-I, by Kenyan filmmaker Wanori Kahiu, I think it is, Kahiu, K-A-H-I-U. And it's a beautiful short film that imagines a future filled with issues of environmental scarcity, particularly of water. It interrogates about race and gender, and even ideas of social control and surveillance and intellectual sovereignty, all in this, all embodied in one young woman's quest to kind of restart or reboot or affect the outcomes of this very limited society that she lives in. And so I teach multimodally. Coming through the arts to me means using all manner of media. And so I recommend this film in particular for its imaginative plays, its social issue play, but also its kind of visceral visual elements as well. So I'll pass it to Loom.
Yeah. Unfortunately, Loom couldn't join us today because of a conflict, but hopefully we'll be able to hear her voice through the podcast that we recorded, and hopefully we'll be able to share before the weekend is over. So we've been throwing around the word speculative a lot, but we haven't quite defined our term yet. And so I'm going to ask that our wonderful guest panelists go ahead and try to explain what you define as speculative when we use this term, and then also how you see it intersecting with the work of Maxine Greene as well, and where that intersection lives for you when you think about your teaching learning practices, or just in general, what made you come to this particular conversation in this way?
I guess I could go.
Yeah, go for it, Amanda.
All right, thanks. So as I said before, speculative fiction to me is literally imagining the world as if it could be otherwise. And I think of it both as Maxine talks about that, imagining possibilities, and Paulo Freire also said something similar to that in terms of the idea of if the peasants who are revolting, if they will only work to change the world if they can imagine a different world than the one we live in. So that's the sort of attitude with which I approach the teaching of speculative fiction in my classes, that I think that there has been very little attention paid to imagination beyond like kindergarten in American education. You know, that's why I asked Pam and James that question about how the work continues into of secondary, because I find that by the time students reach me in college, most of them have no relationship to art beyond pop culture. So often I'll start there with pop culture and say, let's explore the aesthetics of what these artists like. For instance, in terms of speculative fiction, I started my course this past semester with the work of Janelle Monáe and her video of Dirty Computer, because while she's a pop music artist, her work is very much grounded in speculative fiction and the idea of, she made this music video that was basically about this sort of fascist society trying to erase people's memories and fighting to retain memories, and because we are our memories, we are constituted of our relationships. So so she explores that through a popular music venue, and so that was sort of launching our discussion into imagining the world as if it could be otherwise. And then, you know, through studying various novels and films, the culminating project, what was that I told students that they had to choose one of the work suite study and create their own work of art in response to that. And the rule was they could do anything they wanted as long as it was not an academic paper, because these are all honor students. They've written lots of academic papers. They know how that game is played, but so it was kind of throwing them off the deep end, and they were writing poetry and they were writing songs and they were creating videos and having fun. And so I think that the notion of speculative fiction for me is about the idea that everyone should have a voice, that and them playing in the world of creativity was also reinforcing that idea of having a voice, because they were no longer playing the school game, as they're all very good at, because these are honor students. And so that was undergraduates who are not necessarily in education. And then in the education world, I think it's also important in a teacher education context that those graduate students who are doing these very serious things to get certified as teachers also learn how to play and to integrate that into serious learning, and that play is serious work, even when you're grown up. So we started with Kindred, and then we moved into a little known work of Toni Morrison's called Recitatif. It's a short story in which there are two characters, and one is black and one is white, and we're never allowed to know which is which. So that really brought us into a deep discussion about what is identity and what does it mean, and what does binariness mean, because we live in such a binary world. So I could go on and on, as you probably guessed by now, but I want to kind of toss it back to Deirdre and Olu, and then we'll just see where it goes.
Go for it, Deirdre.
Great. Thank you. So I came to Maxine's work, of course, through the study of art and education, but I've always taken up the idea of the speculative, kind of linking it to my original love, which, you know, in primary and secondary school, I was a full-out science geek. And I've always drawn parallels to the idea of speculative thought imagining the world as if it were otherwise, and the question of what if, which is at the root of the scientific process, the hypothesizing about what we know and the questions that we ask ourselves, and how can we speculate as, to the answers to questions that we have based on what we know and what could be possible as an outcome. And then you go about the process of experimenting and trying to answer those questions. So I very much see speculative thought tied to a scientific process, which also translates to an artistic process, because when we talk about design thinking and we talk about, artists engaging imagination, we're still speculating as to what is possible. And so it's the interplay of all of those different threads that really fascinate me about speculation. And I've always wanted to tie the ability to speculate or to imagine or to design futures in the work I do with young people and with students. And so having that flexibility to always add speculative thought into the work really helps me translate that kind of thing, whether I'm doing work or I'm doing, straight art history work, or we're really in between those thoughts. I really love the idea of aesthetic activism that was being discussed. I think one of the participants or presenters talked about it. But in the social, we're thinking about the social world, the social issues, and the blend of, our disciplinary in our real world and political, cultural issues. I've always blend both the aesthetic and the speculative. And so that informs what I do in schools, and the way with which even we look at history, and how I think a lot of history writing and historical thinking is also speculative. We only have so much evidence as to what happened in the past. And then as we build narratives and we build stories, we're drawing inferences from those pieces of evidence, those little clues about the past, and we're speculating as to what the larger stories could have been. And so I see speculative thought and aesthetic thought as very interdisciplinary.
I really appreciate these two different threads, because it has me also reimagining or rethinking my personal relationship to speculative fiction and to Maxine Greene's work. And I could say that I came into speculative fiction as a fantasy nerd. I was just really into reading all fantastical sci-fi books when I was younger. And so often all the books that were sci-fi in school and were speculating different worlds were always white male. They were always about things that were just like outside the locus of my particular environment, outside the locus of what I knew and understood to be my reality. And it wasn't until college where I started reading Octavia Butler, when I started being acquainted with Nydia Okorafor, when I started getting acquainted with Helen Oyemi, that I started to see a different type of book in which Black people of the African diaspora existed, but were not always so grounded in or mired in the tragedies or of some of the Black experiences of America, right? It was really interesting for me to be able to see a world where, yes, history mattered, but it wasn't the thing that defined the Black characters in these novels and these stories. And that's where I come into speculative fiction and think about speculative thought when I think about other worlds, and think about it in terms of my classroom and what I look for in it, is the ability to see people of color, people who have traditionally been marginalized in our communities, outside of the traditional stories that have been told about us. What does it look like when we imagine Black folks outside of the locus of slavery? What does it look like when we talk about Indigenous folks outside of the locus of like pre-colonial era where we know very little, and then the reservations. What does it look like when we see all these different communities in ways that are not always mired in this really tragic and like deeply oppressive histories? And I want to lift that up too, because I think when we think about ulterior world and like the history of speculative fiction, it looks so different in the mainstream across different countries and geographies. But I know that for me, that's something I'm always pointing to. That speculative fiction in many ways is a North Star in terms of like, where do we want to be as a people, and what are we trying to keep as a people, or like change as a people moving forward. But I wanted to uplift these really beautiful thoughts and comments and that playful invitation to do that too, in terms of designing and etc. Which actually, go ahead, Amanda.
Can
please, please. Yeah, please. This is a conversation. Please come through.
I just wanted to ask a question about there's so much incredible mythology in African American history about like the people who could fly, and I wonder if how you see contemporary speculative fiction informed by that whole mythological thread.
I feel like I saw Deirdre like wheels turning. Do you want to go for it first? I saw it in your eyes.
You go first to that question, and I'll.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because I remember attending a talk by N.K. Jemisin, and something that she said that I'm still sitting with is that speculative fiction has always been here, that it's always been a practice of everyone, and while the way that we talk about it in the mainstream doesn't reflect that, I try to pull that in to the ways that I think about all these works, right? Which is to say that there is something really beautiful about seeing the mythologies, these stories, like if Black people could fly, being something that has been kept as a freedom dreamer story, as a speculative freedom dreamer story, throughout the ages, throughout the decades, etc. And I also, there was another thought that flew right at my head. And I think what is also really cool about contemporary speculative fiction too is that it also honors stories and peoples that don't also get the limelight as well, in ways that I really appreciate. So while I do identify as Black, I also recognize that my family, I'm Nigerian, right? Like there's very close ties to Nigeria. My parents are from there. And so something about seeing Nigerian histories, folklores, etc., show up in speculative fiction and show up in futuristic speculative fiction always brings me joy, because there's something about seeing that there's a place for these histories, mythologies, traditions, etc., to also still be present and also still be futuristic. And so what I want to say of the thread there for me in answering your question, Amanda, or thinking about your question, Amanda, is the special nature for me about speculative fiction and the ways that it honors mythologies is that it's not always a past thing. It's not always a thing that lives and has died and like stays there. It is something that is continually brought up. It's continually part of the community. It's something that's continually important, because the wheel keeps turning, and we will always return to the things that always like are worth keeping. And I appreciate that in many of these worlds, the things that are worth keeping are things that aren't traditionally even thought to be worthwhile, right? Or things that are usually erased. That's my initial
Thank you
thought.
for that bridge, Olu.
I tried.
But you provide a great bridge for what I wanted to point out, is that kind of the power of the speculative about speculative thought is not just in its ability to expand that we imagine the future, but it also allows us to interrogate and keep alive the past, as you just stated, Olu. But in my work as a social studies educator, working in space of civics and social change, it allows us to interrogate the present for the way that the decisions and the policies and the institutions that we're building present, what futures are being imagined by those decisions. And so the concept of futurity is a very present one. It's like what decisions are we making now? What types of relationships to one another, to our world, to our laws and policies are we nurturing now that forecast a certain kind of future? And so engaging students in thinking about what's the social imagination behind, you know, our conditions in our communities, is a very important one that gets really meta when you think about, well, whose imagination is this society that we live in to begin with? Like, how can we even pull out and say, who imagined these conditions, you know, for not just our family, but for our communities, for our states, et cetera? And when you engage in that kind of thinking about the present, you start to really see how we as human beings are constantly constructing and reconstructing our lives in our world, but to what end? To what future image or imagination are we building toward? And then, you know, I always encourage my students to align yourself with the folks who future the way you want to see it, and get to work in the present.
Yeah, and I think that brings us to this like really question that we've all gotten to like start answering, is like, how has thinking about speculative thought or speculative fiction helped us think about our classrooms, our teaching and learning experiences, whatever they may be? And you've both brought up these really beautiful examples of how you're using speculative text to engage in a different type of imagining, a different type of like a civic exercise, if you, as Deirdre would say. And so I'm curious if there are other ways in which not only has it changed the way that you create your classroom experience, but maybe even the ways that you think about your pedagogy, like how you even begin to approach the exercise of teaching, the practices of teaching as well.
Okay.
It's your party. Go for
right.
it, however you wish.
Deirdre, do you want to go first? Oh, okay. So I would say this has been a journey for me to speculative fiction, starting, oh God, at least 10 years ago, more than that, when the book, The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson came out. And it's a book about the great migration of African Americans from the South to northern cities and the West. And when I read that book, it just hit me like a ton of bricks that there is not a single corner of American society that's not impacted by slavery and the outcomes of slavery and Jim Crow. And then the 1619 Project came out, and that really made that abundantly clear about how healthcare and education and housing and banking and all of it is all a direct result of the social structure that was necessitated in order to support the practice of slavery. And so it became necessary for me to reimagine the world. And I also wanted to populate my courses with the voices of, you know, people who are not dead white men. And so it's become sort of organic now. I kind of looked at my syllabus and discovered, like, oops, everyone in my course is a Black woman except one white woman who's queer. So I kind of just wanted to imagine a world that was not built by the people who built the world that we're actually living in, and how might that look differently? And just getting students to engage in those conversations, speculative fiction became a sort of a framework that encouraged that. So it's like side by side, we've got this historical, factual information that comes from the 1619 Project and Warmth of Other Suns and other works, Ta-Nehisi Coates. And actually, Ta-Nehisi Coates is a great example because he then went into the world of speculative fiction with his book, The Water Dancer. And I also noticed wow, water is really important symbolically, isn't it? Because it runs through all of these different works in different ways. it's really all the project of reimagining the world. And if we can reimagine a world in this fantasy realm, we can reimagine our current world. And the way we do that is by diversifying the voices that are heard. I saw in the chat earlier, James said, why aren't 6-year-olds allowed to vote? And I thought I had to really kind of think about that. And I thought, well, I'm not sure how I feel about that. Maybe 12-year-olds, but the idea is that, we need to really refresh and reimagine the way we see the world. And as Becky Chambers did in her Monk and Robots book, like, what if we actually stopped short of everything being destroyed and we just said, let's rethink this while we still have a chance.
So my teaching and learning has been very much in the Black experience, and especially having, taught with through the Schomburg Library in Harlem, working with teachers and students there for all those years, but even for my personal development has. And so what's became very important to me when thinking about speculative thought and even aesthetic education is that, culturally, and you could even say ethnically, but culturally and ethnically, different groups of people have not only long, even ancient cultural traditions, but they have future ideas about the future. There's a cultural and ethnic social imagination that comes from, ontological and other underpinnings about the world that we see the future. And so it's no surprise to me that, Black Americans or people of African descent in the Americas have a different imagination about the future for themselves, other than what they, experienced under colonial rule. And I mean, you could say that globally, right? And so when you begin to investigate, Afrofuturism, indigenous futurisms, and other kind of rooted cultural futurisms, what you kind of get to lean back into is how, the diversity of ideas about how we could live on this world, not only independently, sovereignly, but collectively. And so I think history, as it's been written, has always, in many ways, accepted a de facto master narrative about the world, which is very Western from our perspective here right now. But, people have always operated with different visions for themselves and their families and their communities in the future. And I would very much say, that enslaved peoples, they survived their conditions being enslaved here in the United States because they had a vision and an idea about a future that could be if they only, outlive the brutality and the scarcity, if they could only get their children educated, if they could only, migrate north and find jobs and find a quiet place to raise their children and to regenerate that kind of vision for a different kind of future. I think that's the thread for me that ties Afrofuturism and a futuristic thought, even our social imagination. It ties us, it links us to all previous generations, and it regenerates. And so again, including our students into the mindset that, they can be a part of building the future that they want to see is very much linked to that tradition of survival and visioning a new way of living.
Yeah, Thank you both. And I think what you're also bringing up for me too is what does it look like for teachers or educators in these like spaces to also help students craft these worlds too, and also model what it looks like to like do the speculative thought too, um, which has me thinking a lot about the, I guess the what I don't, this is a very weird thing to say, but like the promise that of the pandemic and the ways in which it like gave us a way to like a moment, and I forget who said this, but a portal into like thinking differently about what the world could look like, and the ways in which educators specifically, I'm thinking for myself right now, but like how we had to sit and reimagine what school looked like in the middle of a pandemic. What things do we keep? What things do we decide to like change? How can we, thank you, Arundhati Roy. Thank you so much, Nadine. What things are we choosing to like continue on with, and like what things, what policies didn't make sense anymore, and maybe still don't make sense in the aftermath of like the climax of it all, right? And so it had me thinking about the questions that the students would ask us, like, why do we have homework? We're already home. What does that even mean? I'm like, yes, that's true. Like, what is the purpose of this thing that made sense before, but maybe doesn't make sense anymore? Maybe it still doesn't make sense afterwards, right? And so I'm thinking also about what does it mean not only to put the labor of imagining on our students, but also to like co-work with them, right? And like I think that's the other really beautiful promise of speculative work or speculative thought and these like practices is like, how do we also do so intergenerationally? How do we honor the wisdom of our elders, of our folks who've done a lot of this work and have been doing this work? And how do we also honor the potential, the brilliance, the agency of our young folks too in this work? And so that's something that I've heard both Deirdre and Amanda name and like kind of begin to get at. And I also want to look that up too, because I think that's a really beautiful promise of this, of reading these works, of like taking up this thought and this exercise and this practice. And so this actually works as a segue to something that we have been playing about, right? Playing with. One of the things that you've all kind of like have been buzzing about in the chat is this idea of like speculative thought being like a playful exercise, a playful invitation to imagine differently, alternatively, etc. And so, Deirdre, I know I'm gonna like toss you into the forefront with this one, but I think this is such a beautiful exercise, and you are like such a great mind to kind of lead us through it. But we want to play with you all in this moment, and you're just gonna lead us through this playful exercise.
Great.
Hey, Deirdre.
No problem. And so I created this what I call a speculative activity with my students. And they were upper elementary students and middle school students here in Harlem. We were doing extensive community study of Harlem, and Harlem is such a unique and beautiful community, but it's definitely a community that's like rich in its old traditions. Like half of teaching the history of Harlem is teaching about spaces that no longer exist. But so there's a lot of great history, and there's this like buzzing present, and there are all these ideas of what Harlem should be. And so engaging my students in that, we do community walks and local interviews with local residents, even meeting development people who are in development and city planning, etc. And so I asked them this question that I want to ask you all. So think about like your very local community, the city or community where you move in the most, and think about if you were on the city planning committee who had an infinite source of resources to build the future that you wanted to see for your community, what things would you add? What would you keep? And what would you delete? And you can think about those things as brick and mortar, concrete. You could think about an energy. You could think about roads. You could think about institutions. You could think about housing, art, however you want to think about it, because this is a short activity in this space. But what would you add to your community, what would you certainly keep as hallmark of the community? And what would you delete? Say we could get rid of these things. Add, keep, and delete. We'll give you, Olu, timing about 2-3 minutes to think about it, and we'll share.
Absolutely. And I just also am about to drop the written version of that prompt in the chat, just in case you want to reflect on it as well. And if you have thoughts, go ahead and feel free to drop them in the chat as well as we're thinking.
And I want to add one other aspect to it, is in honor of Maxine, is like, so I want to do this exercise with our 5 senses wide awake, alive. So think about relationships too, feelings that we have when we move through our community, aesthetic things that make us feel one way or another. So definitely put your aesthetic lenses on your choices.
Take about 30-ish more seconds, and if you can move to share something that you're thinking about regards to your community, we would love to hear it via chat, via out loud. This is our party, so feel free to jump in however. And thank you for the questions in the chat, Dan. Cool. Okay. In these last, I believe, 2 minutes that we have together, would anyone like to share what they would add, keep, or delete from their community if they had the infinite resources to do so?
Should I talk
Yeah,
out
start
loud?
us off, Amanda.
All right. So I'm thinking about my beloved Bronx borough of my birth, and I would definitely add more green spaces and more opportunities for people to work, play, and learn in those green spaces, and more businesses and cultural centers where the incredibly rich, diverse group of immigrants from all over the world can share their culture and people can learn from their cultures. And what I would take away is the garbage and detritus of gentrification.
Thank you.
Also
Can I
bookstores.
see a hand? I feel like yes, John, I saw you. Yes, go for it.
Okay, well, I would think a little bit bigger in terms of a global thing. I would get rid of the business major. I don't think it's a good major to have. I would have a 25-hour work week because I think everybody's overworked, okay? And I would try to get rid of the corrosive impact of big money on our culture, on our movies, on our theater, and on our artists.
Okay, I appreciate that dreaming, that freedom dreaming, the speculative dreaming, and I really hope we can enact that change soon. I really appreciate that. Yes. Oh, I love that, Liz. Open the doors and take down the walls. Yes, absolutely. I see. Oh, I see a couple hands. Yay. Anne, go for it.
So what I would add with infinite resources would be universal design in every public space, everything, everywhere. And that would, in many ways, eliminate the words accessibility and accommodation and even inclusion. And so what I would keep here in Newfoundland and Labrador is the access to nature and more time in nature. We've got beautiful access here, so that's what I'd keep. And what I would delete is the barriers to access, which circles back to universal design.
Beautiful. Thank you, Anne. Oh, I love that. I feel like I saw one more hand. Marietta, yes? We can't hear you.
I would take the money and convert the hotels that are not being used into homes for people who are homeless or who are in need of mental health services, so that there could be communities of people, not only the mentally challenged, emotionally challenged, but also people who can work with them, and social workers who could work with them, and mental health practitioners. And then I would like to get rid of electric bikes because they seem to be quite hazardous to people. And pedaling bikes is probably wonderfully healthy. And if you can't, do that, if you're taking things from one place to another and you need something like an electric bike, then I wonder if they shouldn't just be a little clearer about the rules so that they don't go on the sidewalk. And there's some way of warning people if they're coming in back of you. Because I've already known 2 people who had broken bones because of being run over or into by bikes. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for your incredible thoughtfulness in this practice. And I hope that it's something that you can take up in your daily lives as you think about the spaces that you inhabit and the ways in which you can affect change and enact change through your own speculative imaginations. I believe our time is up. Yeah, shucks. All right, but it has been, yeah, please, Deirdre, please.
No, I'll just say one quick comment, and it's that this activity is very accessible to students. As Olu said, it's an exercise of freedom dreaming, but it also helps young people identify their values and what is it about that they value about the community, and how do they want to, build more of what they think is important to humanity in that. So when I think about the values that have just been shared, they're really, and that's the way we should be building and planning and working in our communities toward equitable, human, beautiful, nature-rich spaces and experiences. So
thank you. It's a wonderful activity, and it's one where the students could also physically build their vision of it so that we could all see and get some teaching artists in there and get some books to follow. You've started everybody thinking, and if you look at the chat, you'll see, and I think I said, we should start a book club with all of these resources that people have added, but